In this section, we're going to look at Angular material, which is a collection of components that give our applications a modern look and feel. More specifically, you're going to learn how to work with various kinds of components, such as form controls, icons, dialog boxes, progress spinners, tooltips, and so on. You're going to learn how to use the pre-built themes, as well as create a custom theme. You're also going to learn how to use Angular materials typography and create custom typography for your applications. This section is fairly long, so it's best to watch it over a few sessions. Now, let's get started. So what is Angular material? Angular material is a library of reusable and high-quality UI components that are built with Angular and TypeScript. These components are internationalized, so users with different languages can use them. They have a clean and simple API. They're well tested with unit and integration tests. They're customizable, they're very fast and have minimal performance overhead, and they are almost well documented. So let me show you a few examples of these components in action. If you head over to material.angular.io, you can see the homepage for Angular material. Here under components, you can see we have various kinds of components. We have form controls like radio buttons, checkboxes, and so on. We have navigation components like toolbars, menus. We have layout components like lists, cards, grids. We've got buttons, indicators, and icons, pop-ups and modals, and data table. So let me show you a few of these in action. The first one I want to show you is under form controls. So here, let's go to this checkbox. So here on the examples tab, you can see these checkboxes and radio buttons in action. So these checkboxes have the same API as the native checkboxes we have used so far, but you can see they look very pretty. And they also have some nice animation. See that? So very nice. Now we can easily add these to our applications by using Angular material. Let's take a look at another example. So back to the components page. This time I'm going to show you a modal. So under pop-ups and modals, let's take a look at the dialog. Once again, under the examples tab. So here we have a button, launch dialog. And when we click this, we get a dialog with a nice animation. One more time. See, it has a very nice animation. Now, a question that you might have is that we already have the concept of dialogues in Bootstrap. So why should we use this dialog in Angular material? Well, Bootstrap and Angular material, as you know, they are two different libraries built by different teams. Bootstrap was built a few years ago using plain old JavaScript, and it has nothing to do with Angular. So all that JavaScript code that we have in Bootstrap libraries, we cannot easily use them in our Angular applications. We need to create custom directives or custom components and do some magic in order to use those components. Angular material, on the other hand, is built specifically for Angular applications. So we don't have to do anything magical. We can simply import a module and use Angular material components just like how we use our custom components. Also, in terms of the aesthetics, Bootstrap has a different design language. All the Bootstrap components have a different look and feel. Whereas the Angular material is based on the material design, which is a visual language developed by Google in 2014. This is the same language that you see in Google+, in Android, and many other applications. So to answer your question, you can use Bootstrap, you can use Angular material, or you can use both. Angular material is still new. It doesn't have all the components that we have in Bootstrap. So if you want to build an application with a complex user interface, chances are some of the components that you need may not currently be part of Angular material. So then you might have to use Bootstrap. But as I told you before, because we cannot use Bootstrap JavaScript easily in our Angular applications, we have to use third-party components that are based on Bootstrap. And that means our application is going to have a lot of dependencies to libraries built by others. And these libraries can break at any time. So that's why I personally prefer Angular material, because all these components are built with the same list of quality standards. They have a common API, they're well tested, and we can easily use them in our Angular applications. So, enough theory. Next, we're going to install Angular material in our project. In this lecture, I'm going to show you how to install Angular material. Now, before we get started, I just want to let you know that you don't have to memorize any of the steps I'm going to show you in this lecture. All of these are perfectly documented, but you might find it easier to watch the video first and then look at the documentation. So, in the future, you can always go to material.angular.io. Under this guides page, you'll find this guide, Getting Started. And this shows you all the steps that you need to follow in order to add Angular material to a project. So now let me show you these steps in action. First, in the terminal, just like the previous sections, I'm going to create a new project using Angular CLI. So ng new material-demo. All right, beautiful. Now let's go to this folder, material-demo. Here we need to install a couple of node packages. So npm install --save. The first one is angular/cdk. And this stands for Component Development Kit. This Component Development Kit is one of the dependencies of Angular material, and it's basically a library that allows you to build awesome components for the web, but without adopting the material design visual language. So if you want to build a reusable data table that doesn't necessarily have the material design visual language, you can build it with CDK in an agnostic way. So this is the first dependency we need to install. And the second one is the actual Angular material package. So at angular/material. So these are the essential packages that we need to install. Now, optionally, we can install a couple more packages. One is for adding animations. The other is for gesture. So if you want to have those nice animations, also install at angular/animations. And finally, in order to add gesture support, you need to install Hammer.js. So Hammer.js. So Hammer.js is a powerful library that allows you to add gesture support to your pages. For example, you may tap with your finger or swipe or rotate and so on. Now, once again, this is an optional dependency, but I recommend you to add it to your application to make it more accessible. All right, now let's install these dependencies. All right, so the first step was to install these dependencies. Next, we need to include a theme. So let's go to Visual Studio Code. Here under Node Modules, under @Angular, you can find the material folder. And here we have these pre-built themes. So we have a bunch of themes. They're beautiful. The one I'm going to use is indigo-pink, but you may use any other that you prefer. So let's go to styles.css. We need to import a theme, just the same way we imported Bootstrap before. So @import. And here we add the relative path from Node Modules. So start with a tilde @angular/material/indigo-pink.css. Make sure to spell it properly, otherwise it's not going to work. So this was our second step. And now the final step. We need to go to app.module. Here, if you want to add animation support, you need to import browser animations module. Otherwise, you need to import no-op animations module. So let me show you. So if you previously installed Angular animations, you need to import browser animations module from @angular/platform-browser/animations. Okay? So this is the implementation of the animations module in a browser. Now, if you don't want to have animations, instead of browser animations module, you need to import no-op animations module. So I'm going to select this line, duplicate, and change this module to no-op animations module. So now we need to import one of these modules into our ng module. So here in the imports array, I'm going to add browser animations module. So these are the 3 steps that we need to follow in order to install Angular material. Now, to make sure that we have installed Angular material properly, let's go ahead and add a checkbox to our app component. So let's go to app.html. I'm going to delete all the markup here and add a checkbox. So that's md-checkbox. Now let's give it a label, subscribe to newsletter. So in Angular material, we have a custom component for rendering a checkbox, and this md-checkbox is the selector for that component. Now, back in the terminal, we need to serve this application. Okay, it's ready. So back in the browser, we get a blank screen. So let's take a look at the console. We see a familiar error. md-checkbox is not a known element. Because we have used a custom component, but we have not imported this component into our app module. So let's go to app.module. Every component in Angular material is defined in a separate module. So we need to go on the top, import this module here, and then add it to the imports array of our ng module. But how do we know what module a component is defining? Very easy. We go to material.angular.io, components, form controls, checkbox. Now under API, you can see the name of the module in which this component is defined. So this component is defined in md checkbox module. I'm going to simply copy this line back here, paste it. Let's reformat it. Okay. And finally add it to the imports array. md checkbox module. Save. Back in the browser. All right, now we have a beautiful modern checkbox with animation. So over the rest of this section, we're going to explore each of these components in more detail. All right, now let's continue with this checkbox we added in the last lecture. So this checkbox component in Angular material implements a very similar API to the native checkbox we have in HTML5. For example, in HTML5, in order to add a checkbox, we need to use input with the type checkbox. Okay? Now here we have a bunch of attributes like checked. We can set it to checked. We have value. We have the change event and so on. So our custom checkbox in Angular material also has these properties. So once again, if you go back to the documentation for this component, under the APIs tab, we can find all the properties implemented in this component. So here under directives, you can see the name of our component, that is md checkbox. And below that, we have a table with a list of all the input and output properties. Now, there is not enough time to go through each of these properties, and it's really pointless. So I want to show you a few key properties that you're going to use in a lot of real-world applications. So back here, I'm going to delete this native HTML5 checkbox. Now, here's our md checkbox. Here we can set the value exactly the same way of a native checkbox, or we can use property binding. We can bind this to a field or a property in our component. Similarly, we have the checked property. We can set this to checked. To check this by default, let's have a look. Back in the browser. So now our checkbox is checked by default. Or we can use property binding and bind this to a field or property in our component. So let's go to app.component. Here I'm going to define a field called isChecked and set it to true. Now back in the template, I can bind this checked property to is checked. Save, back in the browser. So we can see it's checked by default. We also have the change event that we can subscribe to. So let's bind this to onChange method in our component. And here we can pass the event object. Now let's go ahead and implement this method in our component. So back here, I'm going to add this onChange method. And for now, simply log something in the console. Back in the browser. So click this. Now look at the console. So this is our event object. It has two properties: source, which references our MD checkbox class, and checked. So here's our MD checkbox. You can see all these properties implemented in this component. Now let's say we have some content here. Let's say we have a div, and this checkbox acts as a toggle to show or hide that div. For example, we can change this label to show details. Here I'm going to add a div, and in this div we're going to have some details. Okay? Now when the checkbox is checked, this div should be visible. So here we can use ng if. Now here in this expression, we need to reference our checkbox. So we can simply give it a template variable. Let's call this show details. And here we can reference show details dot checked property. Okay, so back in the browser. Okay, you can see our details div is initially visible. If I uncheck this, it's gone. So this is how we work with Angular material checkboxes. Another component that is very similar to a checkbox is the radio button. So back in the Angular material website, under components page, let's go to form controls and look at this radio button. So as a quick tip, whenever you want to work with a component, look at this overview tab. Here you should see a very simple example of using that component. So here's our radio button. Now if you click this, view source, you can see the markup that you need to write to render this component. So here we have two elements, MD radio group and MD radio button. So we can put all these radio buttons inside a group, and in that group, only one radio button will be selectable. And of course, we can have multiple groups on a web page. So back in VS Code, I'm going to delete this checkbox here. Instead, we need MD-radio-group. And inside this, we need two radio buttons, MD-radio-button times 2. Beautiful. Now here we can give each button a label, like male and female. We can give them a value. We can hard code the value here, or use property binding syntax and bind this to a field or property in our component. Now similarly, I'm going to set a value here. We also have all those properties you learned about in the last lecture. So we have checked. We can hard code this here, or use property binding and bind this to isChecked field in our component. Save, back in the browser. We got a blank screen. So let's take a look at the console. Now this error is a little bit distracting. It says can't bind to checked since it isn't a known property of MD radio button. Unfortunately, the errors in Angular material are still a little bit immature. So what's going on here? Back in the code, I'm going to temporarily delete this bit of code. Save, back in the browser. We don't have any errors anymore. But if you look at the web page, you don't see the radio buttons. The reason for this is because we didn't import the module for this radio button. Now technically, I expect to see an error like MD radio group is not a known element. But we don't get that error. It turns out that there is something common between the checkbox and the radio modules. So because in app module, we imported this MD checkbox module, we don't get that error saying that this radio group or radio button is not a known element. If I comment this out, see what happens. Back in the browser. Okay, now we got a blank screen. And if you look in the console, you see the error I was talking about. So MD radio button is not a known element. So here's the lesson. Whenever you want to use a component, make sure to import its module first. So back in the documentation for the radio button, look at the API tab. Here's the module that we need to import, MD radio module. So back in the app module, I'm going to import another module from angular/material. That is MD radio module. And then let's add a line break here. Okay. So then in the imports array, we're going to have the checkbox module and the radio module. Now, something I need to clarify here. In this demo, I'm not using a checkbox. So technically, we should not import this MD checkbox module. But I'm deliberately leaving this here because later I want to show you a technique to refactor our code. So we imported our radio module. Now, back in the browser, these are our beautiful radio buttons. So now back in the app component, I was going to use this property binding here to automatically check the female radio button. Let's test this. Back in the browser, so we can see female is checked by default. Now, if you look at the documentation for this radio button, here you can see the MD radio group class or MD radio group component. Here we have an input property called value. So we can set the value of the group, and this will automatically check the radio button with that value. For example, back here, I'm going to remove this checked property. So the value of the female radio button is 0. I can set the value of the group to 0, and this will automatically check the female radio button. And once again, the female radio button is checked. So you can see these components in Angular material are very easy to use. All right, now let me show you how to render a drop-down list. So once again, on the Angular material website, under the components page, let's go to form controls and then select. Just like always, we go to the API tab first and find the module in which this component is defined. So that is MD select module. So before going any further, let's import this module into our app module. So here in the imports array, I'm going to add MD select module and then import this with my auto import plugin. Okay, good. Now back in the documentation, let's go to the overview tab and look at an example of the basic markup we need to render a drop-down list. So here we have two new elements. One is MD-select and the other is MD-option. These elements are very similar to the native select and option elements we have in HTML5. So back in app.component.html, let's add a native HTML5 dropdown list and then convert it to an Angular material dropdown list. So we add select, and inside this we need one or more options. We don't need the name and ID attributes. And here this option, we want to render it based on a list, based on an array of items. So let's go to our app.component. I'm going to delete all the code here and declare an array of colors like this. Each color is an object with two properties, ID and name. So we've got red and then green and blue. And of course, let's change these IDs. Beautiful. So back in the template, here we're going to apply the ng4 directive to repeat these options. So let color of colors. Now for the value, I'm going to use the property binding syntax and bind this to color.id. And here we can render the label. So color.name. So this is our native HTML5 dropdown list. Back in the browser, we get this ugly, really traditional looking dropdown list. We can do better. So let's convert this to an Angular material dropdown list. Back here, all we have to do is to prefix these elements with md-. So I put the cursor here, Command and D on Mac or Control D on Windows to trigger multi-cursor editing. So Command and D, the first select is selected. One more time, now both select elements are selected. So we type md-select and press escape. Now one more time, this time I'm going to rename option. So Command and D, one more time, and then type md-option. Save, back in the browser. And now we have this modern drop-down list. That's much better. Now, if you want to pre-select one of the items here, you need to use the ngModel directive. So back here, I'm going to apply the ngModel directive on our md-select element. So ngModel, and bind this to, let's say, a field called color. Now back in app.component, I'm going to define this color field here and set it to 2. So I want green to be selected by default. Now if you go back in the browser, we're going to see an error. So we have a blank screen. Let's take a look at the console. All right, can't bind to ngModel since it isn't a known property of md-select. You have seen this error earlier in the course. The reason for this is because ngModel directive is defined in the forms module. And because this is a brand new Angular project, we have not imported the forms module. So back in app module, in the imports array, I'm going to add forms module. Save, and back in the browser. All right, now you can see green is selected by default. So to convert a native HTML5 dropdown list to an Angular material one, all we have to do is to prefix these elements with md-. In this lecture, I'm going to show you how to work with Angular material input controls. So back in Angular material website, on the components page, let's go to form controls and then input. Just like always, first we start with the API tab to find the module. So this component is defined in md input module. Now back in our app module, in the imports array, I'm going to import md input module and then import this with my auto import plugin. Okay, now back in the documentation, let's go to the overview tab and look at a sample example. So this is how the input controls of Angular material look like. Instead of having the label before an input field, we have a placeholder that is currently on top of the input field. So if I delete sushi here, look, the placeholder is now bigger and more visible. And when we click it, it kind of jumps to the top. So this is a very nice modern effect that you have probably seen in a lot of applications out there. Now let's take a look at the markup. So here we have a new element that is md input container. And inside this element, we have a native HTML5 input element. Now this input element has a directive that is md input. Now you might ask why we need a container here. The reason for this is because in Angular material, we have a few other elements here. For example, we can have a hint below each input field. We can have a prefix, a suffix. We can have error messages. So we put all these inside a container. So back in VS Code, let's go to our app component.html. I'm going to delete all this and start with md input container. Now here we need an input of type text, and we should decorate this with md input directive. We should also give it a placeholder. So placeholder, let's say username. Now back in the browser. So this is what we get. Okay. Now let's take this to the next level. We can have a hint below this input field. So we have a new element that is md hint. And here we can say something like type a unique username. Back in the browser. And this is our hint. Okay. We can also add a suffix here. For example, let's add a span. And here we can have something like @domain.com. So imagine in this form, the user is going to select a username, and this username combined with @domain.com is going to make up their email address. Now, here we can apply a directive on this span that is md suffix. Let's take a look. So here's our suffix. We can add mosh.hamedani@domain.com. We can also have a prefix. So I'm going to duplicate this line and change md suffix to md prefix. And here we can have something like admin dot. Now back in the browser. So we have admin dot mosh-hamedani@domain.com. So this suffix is always there. We cannot delete it. Okay. Now we can also add error messages here. So let's make this input field required. And then here I'm going to add another element that is md-error. Previously in the section about template-driven forms, we used a div with a couple of bootstrap classes to render an error. We used alert and alert-danger. But here, when using Angular material, we use md-error. And by the way, make sure not to use bootstrap classes here. For example, earlier when we built our forms, we always added this form-control class to our input fields. You should not add this here because this will mess up with the appearance of your Angular material components. Okay? So you should either use bootstrap or Angular material when you're building a form. So let's delete this. So I added this required attribute to our input field here. And here inside md-error element, I'm going to add an error message. The username field is required. Now let's see what happens. So back in the browser, note this asterisk here. This indicates that this field is required. And when I click it, the asterisk turns red. However, when I tab away, we don't see the error message because we have not applied the ng-model directive on this input field. So there is no form control to keep track of the validity of this input field under the hood. So here's our input field. I'm going to apply the ng-model directive. And also, as a requirement, we should give each input field a name. This is when we are building template-driven forms. Remember that? So let's call this username. Now with these, Angular is going to create a form control object and associate it with this input field. And this form control will keep track of the validity of this input field. So let's see this in action. I put the focus here and then tab away. And here's our error message. Beautiful. So this is how we work with input fields in Angular material. We can give our input fields a hint, a suffix, a prefix, one or more error messages. And by the way, here we want to render this error message only if the field has an error. So technically we should have something like ngIf. We set this to, first we need to declare a template variable. So let's call this username and set it to ng-model. Now with this variable, we can see if our input field has an error or not. So ngIf username dot invalid and username dot errors dot required. And with this, we can have multiple errors of different kind. Exactly the same way we implemented error handling in the template-driven form section. The only difference is in the markup. So instead of using divs with bootstrap classes, we're using Angular material elements. Okay? So this is all about input fields.
Hi, thank you for watching my Angular tutorial. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and share it with others. Also, you can subscribe to my channel for free new videos every week. This video is part of my complete Angular course with almost 30 hours of high quality content where you will learn everything about Angular from the basic to the advanced topics all in one course, so you don't have to jump from one tutorial to another. In case you're interested, you can get this course with a big discount using the link in the video description. And if not, that's perfectly fine. Continue watching as the next section is coming up.